Our study this morning is in the 52nd chapter of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 52. Looks like the weather has diminished the attendance a little bit. If you think this morning's bad, wait till Wednesday. According to the forecasters, but they're wrong 97% of the time, so it's not going to be bad. Zero weather's good. Gets rid of the bugs and weeds and all that stuff. So, Ned, would you word a prayer for us this morning?
Sure. Dear most loving Heavenly Father, Lord, we're thankful for this day that we have, that we can come and have fellowship one with another. We pray that you'll be with all the teachers this morning, that they'll teach what they've prepared, and we as students will be able to learn and apply it to our lives. Be with Luke this morning when he brings the message to us, that again we can apply it to our lives. We can be better examples for you. Pray, Lord, for those who are sick in our congregation who couldn't be here because of health reasons. We pray that a portion of their health will be restored, that they'll be able to return. We pray for those who have elected not to be here, that we might be able to help touch their souls and their minds and bring them back. Be with our nation, Lord, and keep you as the guiding principle in our lives. Forgive us of our sins, and it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I want to give a little more context to Isaiah. We try to give some context each week. But as you recall, Isaiah prophesied decades before his prophecies came to pass. And then he prophesied centuries before some of his prophecies came to pass. But during he prophesied with regard to the Israelites going into Babylonian captivity. They didn't all go into captivity at the same time. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had made several raids on Jerusalem. So they didn't all go in at the same, in the same captivity cycle. Now, during the Babylonian captivity, who were some of the other prophets that were involved? Who was the main prophet there when they went into Babylonian captivity? Well, Daniel was one. Let's see. Jeremiah was back in Jerusalem. He was teaching, prophesying, and for a time he was some of the people of Jerusalem kind of forced him to go to Egypt. Okay, then who was prophesying to the captives? Ezekiel was prophesying to the captives. Now, Ezekiel was out in the country. Daniel was where? He wasn't out in the country. He was right there by the throne room, so to speak. So you had, during this captivity, you had Ezekiel out in the country. Now, Ezekiel, the first part of Ezekiel relates to the final destruction of Jerusalem. See, people were taken into captivity before Jerusalem was burned, was completely destroyed. And, of course, you had Jeremiah there in Jerusalem, and Ezekiel over here with some of the captives over here in the Babylonian area. And first part of his prophecy dealt with the fact that there's the Jerusalem would be destroyed, and then the latter part of his prophecy, he talks about the dry bones, the restoration, bringing the remnant back at least. Now, where does Esther fit into this picture? Where does she fit into this whole scenario? Esther and Mordecai, her relative, their uncle, great uncle, what they were related, of course. Mordecai was the kind of the protector of Esther. Where does she fit into this whole figure? Well, let's look at some dates. The Babylonian captivity started in 606 AD or BC to and it was a 70-year captivity to 536. Although the first group of captives were in 606 BC, the Jerusalem wasn't completely destroyed until 586, so it was a little later. Then Esther came along in about 478. See, later than that initial captivity. Now, when you read the book of Esther, where were the Jews scattered? There were 127 provinces, or 129? Which? 129, I believe, or 127 or 129. Anyway, where were the Jews among those provinces of Babylon gave away to Persia, and Esther was involved in the Persian captivity, or the Persian realm. Well, Daniel was in the Babylonian. He worked for the Babylonian kings, right? But also, his tenure as kind of the, he was a chief advisor to the king, to Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel's tenure in that area lasted into the Persian dynasty, the Persian rule, the Persian kingdom. So we have, Ezekiel, we have Daniel, then we have Esther, and Esther came along being the queen about 478. Now, Ezra went to Jerusalem, and Nehemiah went to Jerusalem after the rule of, or after the time that Esther was queen. Now, why do you suppose Esther became queen? Why do you suppose Esther became queen? Pardon me? Well, she's not only saved the remnant of the Jews, but she saved the Jewish population. Remnant or not, she saved the Jewish population, and they were scattered all over the kingdom. How do we know that? How do we know that they were scattered? Where did the letters that were sent out from the king of Persia, in terms of this whole pattern or saving the Jews, it went to every province. So here we have God saving all of them. There were some of them killed, but saving the Jewish population there, including the remnants, but not only the remnants. But Esther really paved the way for the return of Ezra, the priest, to Jerusalem to teach the people. Esther and Mordecai together paved the way for Nehemiah to get back to Jerusalem to build the wall. What was Mordecai's position after Haman was killed, was executed by the king? He received Haman's position, which was, we might call him the prime minister. He was the chief of staff. He was the guy that was kind of in charge of day-to-day ruling matters, you see. And so here Mordecai and Esther, by the way, what do you suppose the attitude of the Persians and the people that day, what do you suppose their attitude toward the Jews was when Mordecai was prime minister, Esther was queen, and they had been saved? What do you suppose the general population? The Jews had, the Jews had some kind of prestige. I mean, they would have had some, prominence. And so God made these Jews somewhat prominent in that Persian Empire. Now, but did they all appreciate it? When the order went out to the Jews can go back home, few of them went back home. Now, let's put ourselves in that position. I mean, having some, acceptance in that society, the protection of the king, the protection of a fellow Jew, Mordecai, the queen, Esther, being a Jew. Put ourselves in that position. We would have been probably would have had property, we'd have had families, we would have had, a great, somewhat comfortable situation. How about us? How about me? Would I want to go back to Jerusalem? No temple, no walls, no houses, no crops, and tribes around or peoples around giving you trouble. Did the Jews have any problem from the outside and when they were building the temple? And in fact, the temple, it took 20 years to rebuild the temple. Why? Well, they were building the walls and fighting at the same time. But in terms of the temple, some of the folks around about had convinced the authorities back in the Persian realm, had convinced them that this is a bad idea to rebuild the temple. Well, eventually they got the temple rebuilt. But then the walls of Jerusalem were still down. Nehemiah, by the way, how did Nehemiah become next to the king? The cupbearer of the king. How did he get into that? How did he worm his way into that position? Well, this is all the providence of God. So, back to the idea, would you want to go back? Would you really want to go back to Jerusalem if you were, a well-established Jew in that area of the world? I mean, you'd have to think long and hard about going back to the rubble, right? So, who went back to the rubble? What kind of Jews went back to the rubble? Just a few righteous Jews. And we think, boy, those Jews were just unappreciative. They were just secular. They were worldly. But then, what would we do? Now, why are there so few members of the kingdom at any given time in the world? Why are there so few members of the church at any given time?
They got comfortable in the surroundings that they were in.
I mean, it's pretty comfortable. It's like one time I was at I hesitate to use myself as an example because it seems self-serving, but maybe a point. I was at a reception, a political reception, and everybody was, had some whatever to drink, and I wasn't drinking. Obviously, I've never had a taste of liquor in my life or beer or anything, so I wasn't involved in that. But the guy said, "Hey, I respect the fact that you're not drinking." He was drinking. I respect the fact, and I thought, well, maybe he would learn a lesson. He said, "I respect you, but I wouldn't want to be like you." The point. Yeah. He wouldn't want to be abstain from that sort of thing. Well, the Jews were in a very comfortable situation there, and they had Jews in the government, and so why would you want to go back to nothing when you had something over here? And by the way, it's quite a distance from the Babylonian Persian Empire area, the city of Babylon. Quite a distance back home, isn't it? Back to Jerusalem. A lot of miles, a lot of desert, a lot of highway robbers on the way. So why would you want to go back there? I mean, that's kind of probably the thinking of them. And let's look at in 52, chapter 52, and verse. We covered a little bit this last week, but let's begin there at verse 5. 127.
It actually says over 127. It says over 127 prophets. So it could be 129. Yeah.
Well, anyway, it was a lot of a lot of different political subdivisions there, and so now back to the prophecy. This is what was going to be happening, 100 years after Isaiah. Now, therefore, what have I here? Now, God is talking to the folks there. Well, let's go back to verse 4. For thus said the Lord God, my people went down aforetime into Egypt to sojourn there, and the Assyrian oppressed them without cause. Okay. God is reviewing the situation. with these captives. And he says, "Now therefore, what have I here? Saith the Lord." What have I here? Now what's going on? You know, in the past you were in Egyptian captivity. You were oppressed there without a cause. They weren't in Egyptian slavery. Were they in slavery because of their sin? Were the children of Israel in Egyptian slavery because they were just bad actors?
They were in slavery because they just weren't, because they were taken by their power. They had no control over it.
Yeah. But it wasn't necessarily because they were bad people.
They just didn't have the armies, manpower, and ability to overtake that bigger animal.
Yeah. But now, God sent them down there to preserve them. Okay. Now, God says, well, what have we here? Now, in Babylon, what's the situation? Why were they in Babylon? Because of sin. So God says, what have we here? This is a different scenario. This is a different situation, right? This is different. Now, therefore, what have I here, saith the Lord? Now, God has a situation here to deal with. And what's the situation? Israel was worse than Sodom and Gomorrah in some respects, and they were being punished for that, right? But what's God's dilemma? Pardon me? He had a covenant with Abraham. That's his problem. I mean, that's his situation. I'm not suggesting that God had a dilemma there, but that was the situation. He had a covenant with Abraham. He had a covenant with who else? Isaac, Jacob, and the children of Israel. He had a covenant with them. And so what's he going to do? He's got to keep the covenant. And so as rotten as these people were, most of them, he had to preserve them. Now therefore, what have I here? Saith the Lord, that my people is taken away for nothing. Well, they were taken away for their sin, but you know, it was just a bad situation. And those that rule over them, okay, they were howling. Now, this idea that those that ruling over them were howling, it's kind of like a lion roaring after, getting a prey, right? They were just, really boastful. Yeah, they had the people of Jehovah God under their control. They were boasting. They were howling with great glee, so to speak. Therefore, in verse 6, therefore my people shall know my name. Therefore they shall know in that day that I am he that doth speak. Behold, it is I. Well, he's going to release them. He's going to release that group back to Jerusalem. And then they're going to know his voice. Behold, it is I. Then how beautiful, in verse 7, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth good tidings. Okay. How beautiful upon the mountains are feet of him that bringeth good tidings. that publisheth peace, that bringeth good tidings of good, that publisheth salvation, that saith unto Zion, Thy God reigneth. Now, Isaiah, in the next chapter, is publishing good things. And, you know, that's a really a beautiful thing. How beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of him that bringeth forth good tidings. And, of course, ultimately it was Christ that brought forth the good tidings and pronounced salvation, that saith unto Zion, Thy God reigneth. Now in verse 8, the watchmen shall lift up the voice, with a voice together shall they sing, for they shall see eye to eye when the Lord shall bring again Zion. Great things are going to happen. Now, let's see what application that has to the New Testament. Let's turn to Romans 10:15. Romans 10:15. The writer of the book of Romans says, let's go back to verse 13. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? Or how shall they hear without a preacher? And now, in verse 15, and how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah saith, the Lord hath said, who hath believed our report? Where'd the writer of the Roman letter get that information? Well, obviously from the book of Isaiah. And he's talking about great, marvelous things to happen in the future. Break forth into joy, he says. Break forth into joy. Sing together, ye waste places of Jerusalem. For the Lord hath comforted his people. He hath redeemed Jerusalem. They're obviously talking about the return of the remnant to Jerusalem, but more so talking about the New Testament covenant. Then in verse 10, the Lord hath made bare his arm, his holy arm, in the eyes of all the nations. The Lord hath laid bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of our God. Now, that idea that the Lord made bare his holy arm in the eyes of all the nations, and the ends of the earth shall see the salvation of God. What's that idea that the Lord laid bare or made bare his holy arm? Well, he's going to keep the covenant, as Kathy alluded to. He's going to keep the covenant. And how extensive is this covenant? How extensive is this this salvation going to be? Well, it's going to be to all the nations, you see. The law of Moses didn't necessarily go to all the nations, but the gospel is to go to all the nations. We're well familiar with Matthew 28:18-20, where they were commanded to go into all the world. Well, that happened in the first century, and the kingdom today continues to be worldwide. In verse 11, he says, depart ye, go ye out from thence, touch no unclean thing. Go ye out in the midst of her. Be ye clean that bear the vessels of the Lord. Why was it important for this remnant to go back to Jerusalem? Why was that important? In addition to the fact that that was in God's plan, but why was it important for the prophet to say to the exiles, depart ye, depart ye? Yeah. He said, depart from the uncleanness. Touch no unclean thing. Go ye out in the midst of her. Be ye clean. It was necessary for them to get out of that social order. Now, why, in this era, we are in this world, but we are not to be of this world. Now that's a pretty, that's like, seems to me like that's kind of like walking a balance beam. Being in the world, but not of the world. How does that happen? How do you do that? How do you partake of the luxuries of this social order? The clean water, the pantry filled with food, the refrigerator filled with the good stuff of life, being somewhat accepted by the world, right? So how do you navigate all of this to keep clean from the world? How do you do that? Why do you suppose God suggested and Paul condemned those who weren't meeting together regularly, right? I mean, one way is to be together. You see, but that's really a difficult situation. Now, if we had nothing, if we were in abject poverty, if we had exactly nothing, that we were considered the outcasts of the world, it wouldn't be too hard, would it? To come together, right? But we're in a pretty comfortable situation, are we not? So how do you the trick is, how do you remain clean? How do you remain not partakers of the world's things? The Jews, that's been a decision that has to be has had to be made by every generation throughout the world, you see. Well, he says, he told the Jews, get out of there. Then in verse, let's look at, let's reread verse 11. Depart ye, go ye out from thence, touch no unclean thing, go ye out of the midst of her. Be ye clean, that bear the vessels of the Lord, that bear the vessels of the Lord. When the Jews returned to Jerusalem under Cyrus's decree, the same vessels that the Babylonian king Belshazzar, when they had that drunken feast and they were drinking out of the temple vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had brought from Jerusalem. That was the period of time when they saw the handwriting on the wall. Who brought those vessels back to Jerusalem? Zerubbabel. Maybe some of them were brought back by Ezra and Nehemiah, but they were brought back. Verse 12, for ye shall not go out with haste, nor go by flight, for the Lord will go before you, and the God of Israel will be your reward or protection. Now, in earlier in verse 5, verse 4, he talked about the flight from Egypt. Now, the flight from Egypt, how would you characterize the flight from Egypt? How would you characterize it? Well, we here at midnight, when they put the blood of the lamb over their doors, around their doors, and they were to be dressed and ready to roll, right? That was the and so they took off, so to speak, in the dead of night, and finally Pharaoh scratched his head and said, those people are gone. We got to get after them. and they, it was with haste. But now, what about the people going back to Jerusalem? For you shall not go out with haste, nor go by flight, for the Lord will go before you. When the remnant came back from captivity, did the armies of Cyrus pursue after them? And no. In fact, Cyrus said, I'll help you. He gave him provisions. It was a different story. He says, it's going to be, a peaceful exit. Then, verse 13, another paragraph begins, another series of thoughts. Behold, my servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and be very high. He shall be very high. So shall he sprinkle many nations. The kings shall shut their mouths at him. For that which had not been told them shall see them, and that which they had not heard shall they consider. Now, he couldn't be talking about anybody connected with the old racial, physical Jerusalem. Couldn't be talking about somebody connected there. Was there ever a king of Jerusalem? Ever any great leader in Jerusalem that was able to stave off all the warring tribes and nations that came after Jews after they were taken away in captivity? In Luke, in your study Tuesday night, as you follow that up, I mean, what kind of existence did the Jewish nation have from the time of their return, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the wall, to the time of Christ? What was their existence like?
They was always ruled by somebody.
Pardon me?
They was always ruled by somebody.
Yeah. They were now Luke's lesson on Tuesday night had to do with the enemies of the church, right? But going back before that, the Jews had just enemies all over the place. And so, in this verses 13 through the rest of the chapter, when he talks about my servant, he's talking there about Christ. My servant shall deal prudently. He shall be exalted and extolled and very high. As many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred, more than any other man, and his form more than the sons of men. Now, when it says there, many shall be astonished at the servant, what do you suppose the prophet is, what picture is he trying to paint there? Pardon me? Well, was this servant, which we know to be the Christ, was he what they really expected? Is he what the Jews really expected? No. So, when the Jews saw that Jesus was, that his visage, his countenance, his being was marred more than any other man, all the suffering that he went through, I suppose would have been hard to recognize him. It says he was marred more so than the sons of man. So when they saw that, are we finished, Sonny? Are you okay? When they saw that Jesus when the Jews saw that Jesus was in that situation, what'd they do? They abandoned him. In fact, the crowd said, crucify him, crucify him. Let's get rid of him. Because he wasn't what the Jews, at least most of the Jews, had expected at the time. I thought Sonny was going to collect my microphone here to keep me quiet.